Hello and welcome to this short psychology topic video, this one for IB psychology, looking at the essay question, discuss the use of brain imaging technology when investigating the relationship between biological factors and behaviour, for 22 marks. Now I think this is one of the harder essay questions, but I know some teachers actually disagree with me and think it's a relatively easy one. But either way, the purpose of this sort of webinar is to look at some hints and tips on extended response ERQ writing generally, to outline assessment criteria for ERQs in IB psychology, and then more importantly, and linked to this question, to explore what we really mean by the term critical thinking and look at how we can demonstrate critical thinking through the essays, okay? To start with, let's look at providing some hints and tips generally when it comes to ERQ writing. Now, I'm sure your teachers have all told you this, but the first thing, of course, that you look at in terms of essay questions is, of course, your command term. And in this particular essay, the command term is discuss the use. Now, I'm sure you're also aware that discuss the use means to offer a balanced review that includes a range of arguments. And therefore, by its very nature, a balanced review will include both strengths and limitations. So in essence, this becomes an evaluation style question. The other thing when approaching this question, I've always told my students to do, is to change the word use for the word useful. And I think that just gives this question a little bit more focus. So if we change that word and slightly reword the question, what we get is the question is asking us to discuss how useful brain imaging technologies like MRI and PET scans are when investigating the relationship between biological factors and behaviour. And I think if you think of the question in this way, it just gives you a little bit more sort of focus when answering the question, okay? The other thing that we need to take into consideration, so the final factor, is to look at what I call the hook of the question. What does the examiner expect you to keep referring your knowledge and your discussion to in this particular answer? Now, in this particular case, it's the last bit of the question, the relationship between biological factors and behaviour. Therefore, in this particular question, you must continually link back the idea of investigating the relationship between biological factors and behaviour to your knowledge of the scan techniques and also your discussion around them, and that's really, really crucial. So now that we've sort of unravelled the question, you understand what the command term is, you understand what the hook of the question is, you need a structure. And I think it's so important with a question like this to consider how you're going to write it before you attempt writing, and it goes without saying. Let's imagine that best case scenario, you could write around 1,000 words in the exam, okay? And you also know that in reality, you're going to be discussing two different technologies. If we spend a moment just thinking about what a potential structure might look like. If I was approaching this essay, of course you need an introduction. You're then going to talk about one of your brain imaging technologies. So I might discuss the positron emission tomography first, so PET scans, okay? We then need a description of what it is and what are the potential problems when using that technique. We're going to draw on some research, so I'm going to select Raine here. I think I'm going to draw on a study by Raine, and then from that I'm going to look at the strengths and limitations of using a PET scan for Raine study, okay? So that gets us halfway. And I might even bullet point down what my strengths and limitations would be, okay, to ensure I've got that balance. I'm then going to bring in my second brain imaging technology, and I might use MRI here. Again, I need a description of what the MRI scanner is and its potential problems. I'm going to draw on a study, and then again I'm going to have a discussion centred around strengths and limitations. In this case I'm going to focus more on the limitations, okay? So I've actually just bullet pointed at a couple of limitations there, and then I'm going to conclude. So quite a sort of logical, sensible structure. But the reason to plan it is not just so that we know what we're going to be writing, but more so that we can work out how long we should spend writing each particular section, okay? If we know that we've got that structure, what we can then do is put some really rough numbers down in terms of my introduction might be 50 words, my conclusion might be 100, and if I know that I'm writing 1,000 words in total, that leaves me with approximately, and as I say, these are rough numbers, about 425, 450 words for each of my different brain imaging technologies. Now, with that in mind, that means we've got to describe what the technology is, outline a study, and then draw a discussion within around 400 words. So there's quite a lot to write in a few number of words, okay? So very, very tricky essay. This is why I think it's quite hard, okay? Now, with that in mind, I want to show you sort of half of a model essay, the first half, to show you actually how that can be achieved. But more importantly, to highlight those techniques I mentioned earlier. Firstly, linking back to the question and also making sure I've got a balanced discussion outlining both strengths and limitations. So here's my introduction. Brain imaging technology is one method relevant to research at the biological level of analysis, as it enables the researchers to examine the structure, function and activity of the brain, to examine the relationship between biological factors and behaviour. So you can see within the first 3 lines I've already linked my answer back to the question. I'm showing the examiner that I've actually read the question and I'm answering it. Such methods include PET scans and MRI scans. Now, I've read many essays for this question over the years, and what a lot of students do is tend to list them all and start to describe them all. There is no need. If you're going to talk about 2, very simply, you just want to list the 2 that you're actually going to talk about, okay? Now, from here, I said I was going to go on to outlining my first PET scans in this case, and maybe draw on some issues with PET scans, okay? Which is what I'll do now. So PET scans are a type of nuclear medicine imaging which uses a small amount of radioactive material to diagnose and determine the severity of brain diseases, including cancers and neurological disorders. PET scans involve the injection of a radioactive tracer, and this tracer then appears as a bright colour on a scan, indicating which areas of the brain are the most active in metabolising glucose during a task. The brighter the colour, the more active that part of the brain during that particular task. So you can see I've outlined what the scanning technique actually does, okay, and I think that's important. You've got to describe how it actually works, which I've done there. What I then go on to is to draw on some general limitations at this stage, and many students will do this in their essays. So PET scans cannot be used by everyone, and some people are actually allergic to the radioactive tracer. Furthermore, PET scans can't be used on children and pregnant women, and are therefore unable to measure the relationship between biological factors and behaviour in these groups of people, which is a slight limitation of the technique, and I'll come back to that idea later. So I've done my introduction, I've outlined a study that uses a PET scan, and what I'm now going to go on to is to actually, or I've mentioned a study, I'm now going to actually outline a study in full, okay? So I've chosen the Raine study here, and you'll see I've actually just signposted my aim, method, results, conclusion. Now I wouldn't do that in your actual essay, but it's just to show you that it can be done. So I'm drawing on my first study. Raine used PET scans to demonstrate a biological correlation between impulsive behaviour and a lack of prefrontal cortex activity. Okay, I've got my aim. Raine used a sample of 41 murderers, 39 men and 2 women who pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and 41 aged and sex-matched controls. Okay. Raine found that the participants who were not guilty by reason of insanity had lower glucose metabolism in their prefrontal cortex in comparison to the controls. The conclusion: it might be inferred from these findings that the not guilty by reason of insanity murderers do not use their prefrontal cortex to interpret and respond to non-emotional stimuli, reacting instead in an emotional manner. The key is here, you'll see that I've actually summarised the study in only 100 words, and I think that's important. Again, many essays I've read over the years of looking at these questions, that students will often write these really lengthy sort of summaries of Raine that go on for 200, 300 words. And what that does is then prevents you from having time to actually discuss the strengths and the limitations, okay? So we've done our introduction, we've outlined how the technology works, we've now outlined a study. It then comes on to now the important discussion part, and I'm going to start with a strength. The use of PET scans allowed Raine to investigate the link between a biological factor, lack of prefrontal cortex activity, and behaviour, impulsive behaviour in this case. Such findings would not have been possible without the use of PET scans, which could be used in a clinical and forensic setting to inform rehabilitation programs and go some way towards preventing crimes from taking place. Okay. Furthermore, by establishing a biological correlate for behaviour, it is arguably easier for researchers to understand the reasons behind specific behaviours, in this case, unpremeditated murders. Okay. So I've outlined a strength, but to keep it balanced, I now need to do a limitation as well. However, such research does not provide a full explanation of all of the possible influences on behaviour in question. The results of such studies are correlational, and therefore researchers are only able to conclude that the 2 factors, in this case prefrontal cortex activity and impulsive behaviour, are linked. Consequently, there is no real evidence to conclusively show that the not guilty by reason of insanity murderers' crimes are caused by a lack of prefrontal cortex activity. There could be a huge range of other influences that produce that behaviour, for example alcohol abuse, upbringing, and therefore PET scans are limited as it can only tell one part of a complex story when highlighting a link between biological factors and behaviour. So I spent a lot of time sort of outlining my first half of the essay, and I'm not going to read all of the essay to you. That can be done in your own time. What that looks like on a page is this. Okay, so I've got my introduction. I've got my brain imaging technology, number 1, which is PET scans. I've got my first study, and I've got a discussion. And you can see there what I've done is I've sort of colour-coded it, that the black text is my knowledge, the red text is my criticisms, green text my strengths, but then I've also highlighted where I've linked, and I think that's so important for you to see visually. So that first section is only 461 words. We've covered a lot of content. It contains 235 words of description, 225 words of discussion, and that's important, and I'll come back to that balance later on. And I've also linked my knowledge back to the question 4 times, okay? So if we go back to my structure, you can see that I've achieved the sort of first half of the essay. And as I say, I'm not going to read you the entire essay because that will become rather dull for you. But just to show you, the second half of the essay isn't too dissimilar, okay? So this is the second half of the essay. We've got brain imaging technology 2, we've got MRI scans, some general criticisms of MRI. Study 2, and I've chosen Maguire in this case, a discussion centred around Maguire, mainly focusing on limitations, and then a conclusion which I will read to you in a moment. So if we look at the second part of the essay, 536 words, that's my other half. Only 190 words of description and knowledge, 346 words of discussion because of my conclusion. And also, more importantly, 6 links back to the question in hand in this case, okay? So 6 further times I've used that phrase, relationship between brain and behaviour, okay? I will just read you the conclusion, because despite the number of limitations I've drawn on in this particular essay, that doesn't mean I have to conclude in a very negative way, and actually you'll see that from my conclusion. So I've said the use of brain imaging technology can actually shed light on phenomena that could otherwise remain a mystery. For example, the underfunctioning of the prefrontal cortex in impulsive murderers has led to further research in this area, and that of course is a good thing. Furthermore, Maguire's research has indicated that the brain may be plastic, leading to therapeutic measures being put in place for post-brain surgery patients. Okay? I'm trying to keep a bit of balance here. However, both techniques are criticised for their inability to demonstrate causal relationships and their poor ecological validity. However, what these technologies lack in explaining why specific activities or changes occur is more than made up for in the glimpses they provide as to the structure and activity of the brain. Insights that enable researchers to point with increasing certainty to the relationship between the brain structure and function and subsequent behaviour. So yet again, I've really concluded and hammered home my conclusion, which is linked back to the actual question. So if we sort of zoom out and take an overview of that whole essay, the whole essay is about 995 words long, 425 words of knowledge, 571 words of discussion, and nearly in every single paragraph, as you can see, I've tried to link back the knowledge or the discussion that I've got to the question in hand, and that is what's so important. I'm going to talk more about that in a moment. So there we have it. I've provided you with some general hints and tips. I've also provided you with a whole model answer, and we've discussed the first half in depth. And now what we're going to do is look at the assessment criteria for extended response questions and look at specifically what is meant by this term critical thinking and how can we actually demonstrate that critical thinking. Where is it in my essay, okay? So the way ERQs are assessed are using 3 assessment criterion, okay? You've got your knowledge and understanding really is the first group, your critical thinking and your organisation, and that's broken into criterion A, B and C, okay? Now for knowledge, which was what was the black text in my essay, in order to sort of hit the top mark band, you need detailed and accurate relevant knowledge and understanding, and you need to use the psychological research effectively, okay? So you can see just by the plan that I had there, I outlined the technologies and described them well, and I also drew on sort of psychological research of Raine and Maguire, and used that research effectively because I always linked back the research to the question, and that was highlighted, okay? If you didn't link it back, so let's say, for example, you described Raine and Maguire, but didn't actually explicitly say how and why the study demonstrates a relationship between biology and behaviour, you would have used relevant psychological knowledge, but it would have been with limited effect, and that could pull you down from 7 to 9 to somewhere in 4 to 6. Okay, so you can start to see the difference in terms of criterion A between what is a top mark band answer, 7 to 9, and what is maybe a 4 to 6 mark band answer. Okay, Now, in terms of critical thinking, to get the top marks in critical thinking, it says relevant and explicit critical thinking. Okay, I'm actually going to come back to critical thinking in a second. Let's just quickly move over to organisation. To get 3 or 4 marks for organisation, well organised, developed, and focused. Now, that comes back to well organised. We planned that, and we had a real clear plan in place when we wrote that essay out. Okay, focused on the question. I had it 10 links back to the question. There is no argument with the essay I produced that I actually linked my answer to the question. If those links are missing, you can see that you can have a good structure, so organised and focused, and get 1 and 2 marks. But if it's not throughout the question, if it's not focused on the question, you might end up with 1 or 2 marks there. So those links that I highlighted are crucial for organisation, knowledge, and as we're about to see, critical thinking. So let's turn our attention now to what we mean exactly by critical thinking. So critical thinking in this essay is in relation to the depth of your discussion. And remember, when we said discuss earlier, we said that means strengths and limitations, and how you use that discussion effectively in your answer. So you're drawing on strengths and limitations and saying how and why they're a problem for brain imaging technologies. Okay? Now, in terms of some common discussion points, I've marked loads of these essays over the years, and there are a number of points that people always mention. Very often people say MRI scans are not good for people with claustrophobia. Very often people say that MRI scans are not good if people move because it distorts the image. That's true. Many people say that PET scans are not good because people might be allergic to the radioactive tracer. And many people say that PET scans can't be used on pregnant women or children. Okay. As general evaluation, I often see the phrase scanning techniques lack ecological validity. Many people say they're correlational. Many people argue about the whole false positive, so actually interpreting behaviour in a scan that actually isn't the case. And last but not least, I often see the phrase, such findings would not be possible without a PET scanner. Okay. Now, these all have the potential to be relevant and explicit critical thinking points, but very often students don't use them in an explicit way and don't really demonstrate their critical thinking. So let's take 2 of these points as an example to show you exactly what I mean by that. So I'm going to use the top one, not good for people with claustrophobia for MRI scans. Okay. And I can combine that actually with the PET scan not used on women and children. Okay. And then last but not least, we're also going to look at such findings would not be possible without. Okay. So I'm going to show you what I mean exactly by that. Quite often I'll read a phrase like this in an essay. So MRI scans are not good for people with claustrophobia and PET scans can't be used on children and pregnant women. And then the answer stops there and just moves on to another point. That in itself is critical thinking, but it's not in any way linked to the question. It is just an issue with PET scans and MRI scans, okay? So if we wanted to move up from critical thinking not linked to the question to appropriate, how do we start to actually show the examiner that our critical thinking is decent, okay? Let's add a bit more to that answer. So MRI scans are not good for people with claustrophobia because they're trapped in a confined space, and PET scans can't be used on children and pregnant women. This is a problem because it affects the number of people that can actually take part in these studies and will often make the sample less representative as certain groups of people are not included. Okay, now that is clearly better. That's not a bad answer, but it's still only implicit because we've not said, well, why is that a problem for measuring the relationship between a biological factor and behaviour? And it's that link that I keep referring to that is missing in this particular answer, okay? Let's extend that even further. So we kept the first paragraph, but what we've added to it is, therefore, these techniques are unable to measure the relationship between biological factors and behaviour, there's our question wording, in these groups which limit the findings of such research to a narrow group of people, which means we're unable to generalise the results of such studies to these excluded groups. All of a sudden, we moved all the way, taking a very simple point from not linked to the question to explicit and clearly linked to the question. The examiners would much rather students use a fewer number of points in in-depth detail, like we've done here, than for you to simply list all of the points that you've learned, okay? Let's do the same again for one other. This is probably the one I see the most that frustrates me the most. So many students often write, the findings from Raine's study would not have been possible without a PET scanner. Very, very obvious comment that, okay? Of course, he had to use a PET scanner to get those results. If we wanted to improve that, okay, we could say the use of a PET scan actually allowed Raine to investigate the link between a biological factor, lack of prefrontal cortex activity, and behaviour. Okay, that still isn't the best answer because we've still not said, well, why is that so good? What is so relevant about him investigating that link? So we now need to take that even further. Okay, and therefore such studies would not have been possible without a PET scanner, which could be used for clinical and forensic settings to inform rehabilitation programs and go to some way preventing crimes that could take place, okay? So what you've seen is we've actually now gone further. We've said, why is this point a really applicable real life point? What is the real world application of Raine's research? And we've gone again from a not very critical point to a relevant and explicitly critical point. So you can just see it's all about the depth and linking that depth implicitly to the question, okay? Or explicitly to the question, I should say. So there we have it. We've provided you with some general hints and tips. We've outlined the assessment criteria, and we've looked in depth at what we mean by critical thinking, giving you some examples. What we've done is we've put together a guide for this particular essay where we've got some sort of planning notes on the first page and then that model essay on pages 2 and 3 for you to have a look at, and hopefully you might find that useful. And as always, if you've got any questions, any queries, do join our sort of IB Facebook group or message us on Twitter and we'll do our best to answer your questions and queries as soon as we can. Thank you for watching. Hope you found that useful.